Have you ever looked at history and felt it was, I don't know, more than just a straight line? Or, just random chaos?
Yeah, like there's something else going on underneath.
Exactly. What if there's a deeper rhythm? Maybe a series of repeating cycles, sort of like seasons.
Well, that's precisely the fascinating question we're diving into today.
Okay.
We're exploring insights from the fourth turning, a theory by Strauss and Howe. They suggest history moves in these predictable rhythms.
Rhythms that affect everything. Our lives, society.
Profoundly, even our collective mood.
Yeah.
So our mission here is to pull out the key insights from this material to help you understand these hidden patterns.
And why they matter right now, I guess?
Oh, absolutely. Their relevance is often surprising, maybe even urgent for you today.
So where do we start? What's the core idea?
It begins with this concept called the seculum.
Seculum, okay.
Think of it as like a long human lifespan, roughly 80 to 100 years. And it acts as a fundamental beat, a rhythm in history.
So not a new idea then?
Not at all. It actually has deep ancient roots. You see it in cultures like the Etruscans, Hindus, Greeks. They often saw time as circular.
Which is so different from how we tend to view it now, right? Linear progress or just, well, chaos.
Exactly. And look at our world right now. It really brings this ancient idea into sharp focus. I mean, think about it.
How so?
Well, consider how trust in American institutions, government, business, you name it, has just plummeted.
Yeah, you definitely feel that.
And public debts keep soaring, cultural arguments get harsher. It feels pretty fractious.
But at the same time.
Right, but individually. The source points out something striking. More than 6 in 10 people now describe themselves as very important persons,
Wow, compared to
fewer than 2 in 10 around World War II.
That's a huge shift.
It is. And this kind of societal tension, this individual shift, it's not random. It's exactly the sort of thing that understanding these historical cycles can help us make sense of.
Okay, so let's unpack this seculum a bit more. You said it's a recurring cycle.
Yeah, a natural cycle of history, roughly 80 to 105 years in Europe. But what's really interesting is the Anglo-American history.
It's different there.
It's remarkably regular, about 80 to 87 years, consistently, going way back to the 15th century.
Wow.
And the source makes a really bold claim.
Yeah.
It says this is the only cycle mankind can neither avoid nor alter.
That's huge. Unavoidable. Unalterable. Why are they so sure?
Well, it's fascinating because that cyclical view directly challenges how we usually think about time today.
You mean the whole progress idea, linear time?
Exactly. That idea of
Yeah.
constant progress, like a ski jump to some glorious future. Thinkers like Rostow, Toffler, Fukuyama push that.
Right, but now...
But now the authors point out there's this growing fear maybe that linear path is actually linear downwards,
Oof. Yeah.
which suggests maybe there are limits on our collective free will, that there's this deeper rhythm we're part of, whether we like it or not.
And the alternative view, that it's
Yeah.
all just random.
Yeah, the chaotic time perspective, that events are meaningless, history's directionless, no lessons learned.
Which kind of devalues studying history at all, doesn't it?
Totally. The source notes it's led to real disinterest, especially among students. Why bother if it's just, one random thing after another?
So why did we lose touch with that older cyclical view? You mentioned ancient societies.
That's a great question. Those classical cultures, they built massive monuments, pyramids, obelisks, ziggurats, not to linear progress, but to recurring time. They saw life as an eternal round.
They just got it intuitively.
It seems so. They understood time has a pattern, a rhythm, that restarts and repeats.
So, okay, if they got it, why does it matter for us today? Especially when we try so hard to, flatten every cycle we can, control everything.
Well, that's the irony, isn't it?
Yeah.
Our efforts to smooth things out, business cycles, whatever, often just swap one cycle for another. Think financial cycles, elections, even fashion trends.
Right, we can't really escape them.
And the source makes this key point. This modern attempt, this liberation of the life cycle, paradoxically gives the seculum an even bigger role. Just when we think we're free of cycles, this deep one might be driving things more than ever.
Because we're not paying attention to it.
Perhaps. And it's not just theory. The authors show the American seculum has been incredibly regular, more so than in Europe even.
You mean the timing between major events?
Exactly. They point to the consistent 85 to 87 years between huge crises, the Declaration of Independence, then Fort Sumter kicking off the Civil War, then Pearl Harbor.
Wow. That kind of regularity really makes you think, doesn't it? About where we might be now.
Absolutely. And that brings us right to the core of the theory. the four turnings.
Okay, the seasons of history.
Exactly. Think of them as the distinct seasons within that larger seculum cycle. Each one lasts about 20, maybe 25 years.
And always in the same order.
Always in the same order. Predictable. But the shifts between them, they can be sudden, unexpected, like spring ending abruptly with a humid day, or autumn arriving with a sudden sleet storm.
Okay, so let's walk through them. After a big crisis period, what's the first season? The first turning?
That's called a high. Think of it as spring, the post-crisis era.
And the mood, what's it like?
It's generally really upbeat. Institutions get stronger, individualism actually weakens a bit, and a new civic order takes shape.
So people come together more.
Yeah, society accelerates with this newfound solidarity. The source says people want to gather, nest, plan, procreate, and build.
Yeah.
You often see things like crime and divorce rates go down.
Can you give us a feel for that, an example?
Oh, sure, the American high, roughly 1946 to 1964, right after World War II.
Okay, I can picture that, the post-war boom.
Exactly. Huge optimism, suburban growth like the Levittowns, really strong institutions, a growing middle class. It led to John Kenneth Galbraith calling it the affluent society.
Right. So that's the optimistic spring. What happens when things start to heat up? What's the next turning?
That leads into an awakening. This is summer.
Summer. So more intense.
Definitely. It's a passionate time, often a spiritual upheaval. The civic order that was built up in the high comes under attack from like a new values regime.
So what shifts?
People start prioritizing individual rights over collective duties, the self over society, creativity over conformism. It often leads to social questioning, even chaos, and major political shifts.
And the example for that one would be?
Think the consciousness revolution, roughly 1964 to 1984.
Ah, the 60s and 70s.
Right. It kicked off with urban riots, campus protests, the summer of love, the counterculture,
Yeah.
then later Watergate. It was also the era of the human potential movement and what critics like Christopher Lasch called the culture of narcissism.
The me generation.
Exactly. Questioning everything.
Okay, so after the passionate upheaval of summer, we move into autumn.
Correct. The third turning is an unraveling. The mood becomes more, well, downcast.
How does that show up?
Individualism strengthens again, but institutions tend to weaken. There's an embrace of, liberating cultural forces, pragmatism, self-reliance.
So people might feel okay individually, but society feels less cohesive.
That's a good way to put it. Personal satisfaction might even be high, but public trust drops, culture fragments, debates get harsher, less civil, civic habits weaken.
And the source mentioned that decisive public action becomes really difficult.
Yeah, gridlock often sets in. It's hard to get big things done collectively. And it's important to remember, when this book was written in 1997, they said America was already more than a decade into the current unraveling, which they dated as starting around 1984.
So what did that unraveling look like back then in the 80s and 90s when they were writing?
Well, they pointed to things like large deficits appearing, entitlement growth going unchecked, the gap widening between rich and poor. Remember Mario Cuomo's To America's speech?
Vaguely, yeah.
They talked about an ethical cancer in society, rising tribalism, cynicism, people feeling like civility in America has declined.
Institutions were struggling.
They adapted to individual needs pretty well, maybe, but failed community needs. The author saw it as an era of risk-taking, bad manners, unrest, boom and bust markets.
And the kind of people who became famous.
Right. Lots of artists, moralists, celebrities, known for what they did alone, not really for group efforts.
Okay, so unraveling is autumn, leaves falling, things coming apart a bit, which brings us to winter.
Exactly. A crisis. The fourth turning.
And this one sounds serious.
It is. The source calls it history's great discontinuity. It ends one whole era and begins another. And crucially, they say it cannot be averted.
Wow.
It's a decisive period of secular upheaval. The nation's very survival feels like it's on the line.
How does a crisis start? Is it one big event?
It often begins with a catalyst event, or maybe a series of sparks, something that just snaps the mood of the unraveling.
Could be anything. A crash, an election.
Could be. Maybe even something seemingly small. But it's society's reaction to it that matters. These sparks trigger what they call a fierce new dynamic of public synergy.
Synergy, so people start working together again, but fiercely.
In a way, yes. What follows is what they term a regeneracy. Society starts to pull together, adopts a new civic ethos.
But it sounds intense.
It is. Leaders often start exaggerating problems, demanding consensus, calling for maximum sacrifice.
And how does it end?
It culminates in a resolution. Victors get rewarded, enemies punished, and basically a new society is born from the ashes of the old order.
Glory or something else?
The book says it could end in apocalypse or glory. And chillingly, back in 1997, it predicted this turning would likely begin shortly after the new millennium, midway through the OO decade, so around 2005.
And peak around now.
Passing through a great gate in history, as they put it, by about 2025.
Okay, so we have the big cycle, the cyclium, and these 4 distinct turnings within it. But what actually drives these shifts from season to season?
That gets to the heart of it. It's about the relationship between generations in history.
How so?
The authors have this core idea. History creates generations, and generations create history.
Okay, makes sense.
Each generation, a group born over about 20, 25 years, they live through these turnings, and their collective experiences shape them. And then, in turn, they shape history as they age. They create and perpetuate this seasonal quality.
So generations aren't all the same, they have different roles.
Exactly. Individuals and the generations they belong to tend to take on one of 4 basic archetypal roles.
Archetypes, like personalities for whole generations.
Sort of. It depends on where they are in their collective life journey as they move through the turnings. It shapes their persona, their function in society.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first one?
First is the prophet archetype. Think of the baby boomers as an example.
Wait, prophets. What's their story arc?
They're born during a high, that post-crisis optimism. They come of age during an awakening, often as narcissistic young crusaders questioning the old ways.
Right, the 60s counterculture.
Exactly. Then they mature into principled, often moralistic midlifers. And eventually, they become the wise elders who guide society through a crisis.
What are their main contributions?
The source says their key endowments are vision, values, and religion. And they often try to raise idealistic children, like the Millennials, as their legacy.
Okay, so prophets provide the vision. Who comes next?
After the prophets come the nomads. Think Generation X, or the 13ers as the book calls them.
Nomads. How are they different?
Very different. They're born during an awakening, often feeling like underprotected children. They come of age as somewhat alienated young adults in the world after that awakening.
Kind of cynical.
Often perceived that way. They mature into pragmatic, resourceful midlife leaders during a crisis.
Yeah.
And they age into tough, resilient post-crisis elders.
So more grounded.
Described as savvy but going it alone, sometimes seen as nowhere or tired generations. They tend to embrace risk and prefer free agency. They're the survivors, the pragmatists.
Okay, prophets, nomads. Who's a third archetype?
That's the hero archetype. The Millennials are the key example here.
Heroes. That sounds positive.
Well, their journey starts differently. They're born during an unraveling, often as protected children. They come of age during a crisis, becoming heroic young team workers.
So they step up during the tough times?
Yes. Later, they can show a bit of hubris as energetic midlifers and eventually become powerful elders, who then get challenged by the next awakening.
Interesting. How are they described in their youth?
As budding heroes, junior citizens. They're used to meeting adult expectations. They'll look for guidance from elders and are good at organizing to tackle big collective problems. They want a mission.
Okay, one more archetype left.
Right, the artist archetype, like the silent generation born between the 2 world wars.
Artists. How do they fit in?
They're born during a crisis, often as overprotected children. They come of age in the post-crisis high, usually as sensitive young adults.
More conforming initially.
Often described with a gray flannel mentality in their youth, yeah. But then they break free during an awakening, becoming somewhat indecisive midlife leaders, and they age into empathic elders after that awakening.
So they bring something different later on?
Absolutely. They infuse subversive life and feeling into the culture. Think about the beatniks, early rock and roll that came from the silent generation, the artists. They bring nuance and sensitivity.
Fascinating. So these 4 archetypes are always present, just at different life stages.
Exactly. And how they interact is key. The source talks about shadows and affinity.
What does that mean?
Well, a generation's shadow, that sort of opposite archetype, is usually 2 life phases away. So parents and children often have contrasting styles.
Okay.
But its matching archetype is 4 phases away, like grandparents and grandchildren.
Ah, that explains that common folk wisdom, right? Why grandparents and grandkids often get along so well.
Precisely. The theory suggests there's a natural understanding and affinity there based on their archetypal alignment.
And it also affects parenting.
Definitely. Parents often try, maybe unconsciously, to raise kids whose collective persona will complement their own, not just mirror it.
So you get swings, like overprotection followed by underprotection.
Exactly. That oscillation helps shape the next generation's archetype.
So thinking about the crisis the book foresaw, how did it predict these different generations would act? Let's start with the aging prophets, the boomers.
Right. They were expected to provide the torch of conviction, to guide the moral direction, maybe trading some material security for moral authority as elders.
Any conflicts predicted.
Oh, yeah. Expected to engage in intense moral battles among themselves, probably over how society's resources should be used.
Okay, what about the nomads, Gen X, in midlife during this crisis?
They're the pragmatists, expected to apply toughness and resolution, to become cunning, pragmatic, and colorful public figures.
The ones getting things done on the ground.
Exactly. On-site tacticians and behind-the-scenes bosses, willing to win ugly if they have to.
Any warnings associated with them?
Yes, a stark one. The authors noted a risk that this generation, given their pragmatism and alienation, could potentially lean towards a new American fascism in certain extreme scenarios.
Wow. Okay. And the young adult heroes? The millennials coming of age in the crisis?
They were predicted to show a youthful hunger for social discipline and centralized authority, wanting strong leadership, pushing leaders to take bolder action.
So maybe more willing to accept things like...
Like compulsory youth service?
Yeah.
If it offered a chance for public achievement and belonging, they wouldn't necessarily oppose it.
But there's a downside risk there too.
Yes, a big one. The risk that they could lend mass to dangerous demagogues, that their desire for order could be exploited, leading older generations to worry it can't happen here.
Chilling. And finally, the elder artists, the silent generation, what's their role?
A more difficult one, according to the book.
Yeah.
The frustrating role of bearing incomplete witness, likely lamenting the decline in civility, trying to push for compromise and consensus, but maybe from a position of less power and influence compared to the other generations driving the crisis, sort of sidelined observers in a way.
Okay, so we have these cycles, these generational roles. It sounds very deterministic. Is there any room for free will in this? Can we change the outcome?
That's a crucial point, and the authors are clear. While history might be seasonal, the outcomes are not predetermined. Absolutely not.
So the saeculum doesn't override free will?
No. It just helps explain when large numbers of people are likely to want to push their lives and society in a certain direction. Our choices collectively make a huge difference in how any turning, especially a crisis, actually unfolds.
So what can we do? Does the source offer advice on how to navigate this, especially a potential crisis?
It does. It offers some really profound lessons based on this idea of seasonality. First, they advise rectify.
Rectify.
Meaning, get back to classic virtues: honor, integrity, self-restraint. Build a good reputation in your community. They strongly warn against being just a free agent or part of an organization that seems predatory or parasitical.
Aye.
Because, they argue, a fourth turning won't be kind to those who discard loyalties easily. Community and trust become paramount.
Okay, rectify. What's the second lesson?
Converge. Pay attention to emerging community norms. Don't isolate yourself.
Blend in more.
In a sense, they suggest that in a crisis, the nation's core will matter more than its diversity, which is a pretty stark warning.
Implying potential conflict.
Yes. They warn about the possibility of rough justice, maybe even a nativist backlash against minorities, and people potentially being forced to choose between national loyalty and group loyalty. It's about sticking together, but the definition of together might narrow.
That sounds difficult. Okay, what's the third piece of advice?
Brace, as in prepare yourself. Specifically, prepare for public support systems to weaken or maybe even collapse.
Financially, you mean?
Primarily, yes. The source, back in '97, explicitly advised people to discount U.S. government promises about the reliability of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
Wow, really? That direct?
That direct. They urged people to build their own financial security, save more, and really prioritize good health habits. Basically, become more self-reliant because the safety nets might fray.
Rectify, converge, brace.
Yeah.
Powerful advice. So ultimately, what does this fourth turning mean for society?
According to the authors, it necessitates nothing less than the death and rebirth of the social order.
Death and rebirth.
Yeah. It fundamentally reshapes the basic social and economic environment we live in. They call it an ultimate rite of passage for an entire people.
That's intense.
It is. And remember, they wrote this in 1997. Their warning then was stark. Right now, in 1997, we have 8, 10, perhaps a dozen more years to get ready.
Which puts us well past that window now.
It does.
Ugh.
We can't stop the seasons of history from turning. But the point is, we can prepare for them. We can choose how we face them.
So the final thought for you listening is really about that choice. Reflecting on these cycles, these generational roles, what will you do? How will you prepare for this potential secular winter?
Yeah. How will your choices, your actions, contribute to the story that gets told later? The great myths and legends that future generations will inevitably create about our time of trial.
Because the cycle continues, right? Even if a crisis ends badly.
History shows that even a war-torn society that suffered enormous trauma restored the equilibrating sequence of secular turnings. The seasons eventually return. The question is how we navigate the winter.